That first reading from Isaiah gave hope to a people just returned from exile. Isaiah spoke of a great feast for God's people at the end of time. Now, on reading this passage, I remember not the end of time, but celebrations of the past, the 1930s, the Great Depression, and the many celebrations we had in our apartment. Birthdays, confirmations, graduations, Christmas, Easter. My father had a stable, relatively good job, and so the extended family gathered here with us. Aunts and uncles, cousins, our grandmother. You know, the menu was predictable. Ham, German potato salad, yams for Uncle Joe, often forgotten on the kitchen table, Jell-O salads, green beans, of course, my mother said that, and there was my bachelor Uncle Bill, scarred from the many battles he had in the First World War, Verdun and many others. But Bill always brought a bottle of wine. The times were tough, and all the adults were anxious and feeling very vulnerable. But there was much joy in the celebrations, and we kids were reminded of the goodness of life. So comforting to be together. The unspoken conviction, somehow we'll get through these times. Now, the Jewish exiles must have experienced life in the same way. Discouraged, wondering. And so they heard the promise of God. At the end of time, all peoples will celebrate with rich, tasty food and pure, choice wines. And more, God will destroy death forever. All these promises, these extravagant words to a people discouraged, searching for a renewed identity, hungry for such a feast, thirsting for understanding. But what about now? All their expectations have been dashed. The land, the Davidic monarchy, the temple, the promise that these would be theirs forever, and now all taken away. And whenever the bottom seems to fall out of life, there is always the question, where is God? And Isaiah reached beyond their pain and their disappointment, and instead of soothing their bewilderment, instead of addressing their immediate questions, Isaiah proposed a new, exciting mission for Israel. It is too little for you to be my servants, to raise up the tribes of Jacob and restore the survivors of Israel. Oh no, I will make you a light to all the nations, that my salvation will reach to the ends of the earth. The mission of ancient Israel and the mission of the church today. To so live that the salvation of God will be seen by those around. I wonder how many caught the drift of Isaiah's challenge. Many threw up their hands in despair. Promises, promises, promises. And here we are in this God-forsaken place. They looked down instead of looking up. And others heard Isaiah's ramblings and shrugged in quiet indifference, the way most people in the world respond to the Word of God. Just indifferent. Okay, so what? But there were always those who somehow nurtured those promises and wondered about their import in the flow of centuries and how the promises would be brought to life. Well, one person surely caught the drift and he lived the challenge. And Jesus said, "The feast is ready." And he dispatched his servants to summon the invited guests to the feast, but they refused to come. Those first invited, the Jewish leaders of Jesus' time, of the time of Matthew, of our time. They could not accept the gift of God. They could not accept the mystery that this Galilean peasant was the very Son of God, the one who was the promised one of Israel, Jesus the Lord. But Jesus repeated, "The feast is ready. Go out into the streets and invite whomever you find." And amongst them would be the outsiders, the tax collectors, and the public sinners. And amongst them also would be you and me. And if the hope leaps beyond time, to the future when God's judgment of salvation somehow in God's own way embraces all. And that's the promise that we receive from God. All will come to salvation through Jesus Christ. The feast is ready. It's now. And what is the rich food? The rich food is the Word of God. The Word by which we can put in order our hopes and desires, our fears and our pains. And what is the pure choice wine? Why, it's Jesus. His life and death and resurrection, joining us in community, redeeming us. Now the Father who calls you and me to the feast, expects great things from us. We have the wedding garment, by your presence here today, by my presence, a willingness to commit ourselves to live in the way of Jesus. That's the wedding garment that we have to have. It's the willingness. We're not perfect, and we're only going to approach it, but God expects that we will continuously search and seek to find His way. What is the way of Jesus? Well, it's the whole story of Jesus' life, death, and resurrection, but basically it's forgiving, compassion, understanding. I was so impressed with Pope Francis. When asked about homosexuals, he said, if someone is gay and he searches for the Lord and has goodwill, who am I to judge? Homosexuals, he said, shouldn't be marginalized. They are our brothers and sisters. And he might have added, and our aunts and uncles and fellow workers and parishioners. So we are to live in community in the marriage feast that is now. And that means we listen to our leaders. Pope Francis puts us with our priorities, the poor and the marginalized. Those are the ones Jesus addressed. And since He addressed them, so must we. To live in hope in the ordinary moments of life, in times of joy, in times of sorrow, evidencing by our trust that the Father still presides in life. And then, when we live in these ways, as on the day of fulfillment, it will be said, behold our God, to whom we look to save us. This is the Lord for whom we look. Let us rejoice and be glad that He has saved us.